Elena Marchetti's hands were shaking before she even reached the great oak doors of Vance Manor. A messenger had pulled her away from her work only an hour earlier, saying only that the Duke wanted her present immediately, and that she was not to bring anyone with her. No explanation, no warning. Just 3 words, scrawled on a torn piece of paper. Come at once. She had worked as a bookkeeper for the county's crumbling estate offices for almost 5 years, quietly balancing numbers that never seemed to add up in the estate's favor. She was used to being summoned for small tasks, correcting errors, explaining missing funds. But this felt different. The messenger's face had been pale, his eyes refusing to meet hers, as though he knew something she did not. Now she stood in the manor's cold entrance hall, her shoes echoing against the marble floor, waiting to be led into a room she had never once been invited to enter. The portraits on the wall stared down at her, generations of Vance nobility, watching a poor woman stand where she did not belong. The doors finally opened. A servant motioned her forward without a word. Inside, Duke Alessandro Vance sat behind a heavy wooden desk, a single candle burning beside a stack of papers. He looked older than his years, his face lined with worry that no amount of wealth could hide. He did not stand when she entered. He simply gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit, Miss Marchetti," he said. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, something careful, like a man choosing each word before he let it leave his mouth. Elena sat, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "Your Grace, if this is about the estate accounts, I assure you, every figure has been checked twice. This is not about the accounts." He slid a folded document across the desk toward her. "This is about the quarry." Her stomach tightened. Everyone in the county knew about Ravenscar Quarry. It sat on the northern edge of the Vance lands, silent and abandoned for the past 10 years, ever since a collapse had killed several miners in a single terrible afternoon. Since then, no worker in the county would go near it. Parents warned their children to stay away from the road that led toward it. Even the bravest men in town spoke of it in hushed voices, as though saying its name too loudly might wake something sleeping beneath the stone. "What about the quarry?" Elena asked carefully. "I am giving it to you." For a moment, Elena thought she had misheard him. She almost laughed, thinking it might be some strange joke, meant to test her patience. But the Duke's face remained still, serious, unreadable. "Your Grace, I don't understand. Why would you give me land that no one wants? Land that has already taken lives? Because you are the only person left in this county who still believes in fixing broken things instead of walking away from them," he said. "I have watched you these past years. You have kept this estate from collapsing more times than anyone will ever know. I have nothing else of value left to give. My family's fortune is nearly gone, but the quarry is still mine to offer, and I am offering it to you." Elena stared at the folded paper on the desk, afraid to touch it, as though the ink itself might carry some kind of curse. "People say the ground there is unstable, that something happened before the collapse that no one ever explained." "They say many things," the Duke replied quietly. "Most of it is fear talking, not fact. And the rest?" He did not answer right away. Instead, he looked past her, toward the tall window, where the gray outline of the northern hills could just be seen in the distance. "The rest," he said slowly, "I do not fully know myself. The investigation into the collapse was closed too quickly. I was young then, and I did not push hard enough to find the truth. It has troubled me every year since." Elena finally reached for the document and unfolded it. It was the deed, plain and official, transferring full ownership of Ravenscar Quarry to Elena Marchetti, effective immediately. Her name looked strange written in such formal ink, next to words like grantee and lawful possession. "Your Grace, forgive me, but this feels less like a gift and more like a burden you no longer wish to carry yourself." A faint, tired smile crossed his face. "Perhaps it is both, but I believe more than anything that it could be an opportunity. If there is anyone capable of finding value where others only see danger, it is you." Elena left the manor that evening, with the deed folded carefully inside her coat, her mind spinning with questions. By the time she reached the edge of town, word had already begun to spread. She did not know how news could travel so quickly, but by the following morning, everyone seemed to know that the Duke had given the cursed quarry to his bookkeeper. The reactions were not kind. At the market, an older woman selling bread refused to meet her eyes. Poor girl, she muttered to another customer, just loud enough for Elena to hear. He's finally found someone foolish enough to take that place off his hands. A group of men near the blacksmith shop laughed openly when she passed. One of them called out, "Careful, Miss Marchetti, the ghosts up there don't take kindly to visitors." Elena kept her chin up and did not respond. Though the words stung more than she wanted to admit, she had spent years proving her worth through quiet, careful work, never asking for attention, never asking for pity. Now, in the span of a single day, she had become the subject of every joke in town. Only one person did not laugh. Margaret Doyle, her closest friend since childhood, found her sitting alone near the old stone well at the edge of the square, staring at nothing in particular. "You're not actually thinking about going up there, are you?" Margaret asked, sitting down beside her. "I already own it," Elena said. "Whether I go up there or not doesn't change that." "Elena, 10 men died in that quarry. The ground swallowed half the eastern wall in an afternoon. Nobody knows what really happened, and nobody wants to find out." "That's exactly the problem," Elena said. "Nobody wants to find out." Everyone accepted the fear as an answer, and stopped asking questions. She turned to face her friend. "I've spent 5 years fixing other people's mistakes, Margaret. Balancing books that other men broke through carelessness or greed. For the first time in my life, something is mine. Even if it's broken, even if it's frightening. It's mine to understand, and mine to fix, if it can be fixed." Margaret studied her for a long moment, then sighed, the way she always did when she knew there was no point arguing further. "Then at least let me come with you when you go." "No," Elena said gently. "If something happens, I want it to happen to me, not to you." That night, Elena could not sleep. She sat by candlelight in her small rented room, reading through every scrap of old record she could find about the quarry. Most of the official documents were frustratingly thin, filled with vague language about a sudden collapse and a swift decision to abandon the site for safety. There was no detailed survey, no clear account from witnesses. It was as though someone had wanted the matter closed as quickly as possible, with as few questions asked as could be managed. One name appeared several times in the margins of an old ledger: Bertram Hale, the quarry's former foreman. According to the records, he still lived on the outskirts of town, though he had not worked since the collapse. Elena decided she would speak to him before setting foot anywhere near the quarry itself. She found his small cottage the next morning, half hidden behind overgrown hedges, smoke curling weakly from its chimney. Bertram answered the door slowly, his back bent from years of hard labor, his eyes sharp despite his age. When she explained why she had come, his expression darkened. "The Duke gave you that place?" he said, almost in disbelief. "After everything?" "He did." "I was hoping you could tell me what really happened there." Bertram was quiet for a long moment, glancing behind her, as though checking that no one else was listening. Finally, he stepped back and allowed her inside. His cottage was small and sparse, but warm. A single chair sat near the fire, and he gestured for her to take it while he remained standing, arms crossed. "That quarry wasn't cursed," he said finally. "Whatever the town says, it wasn't spirits or bad luck that brought that wall down." "Then what was it?" "The ground shifted where it shouldn't have. We'd been digging along the eastern ridge for months, following a vein none of us had ever seen before. Strange rock, heavier than anything we usually pulled from that ground. Some of the older miners said we were digging too deep, too fast, without proper support beams. I warned the overseer myself, more than once." "And no one listened?" Bertram's jaw tightened. The overseer at the time answered to men outside our own county, men who wanted that vein pulled out quickly, whatever the cost. When the wall came down, 6 men were lost. The investigation that followed lasted less than a week before it was declared an accident and closed. No one asked why we were pushing so hard into unstable ground in the first place. No one asked who benefited from us working faster than was safe. Elena felt a chill settle over her, unrelated to the room's temperature. "Do you know what happened to that vein? Was it recovered?" "No," Bertram said. "After the collapse, everyone fled. No one dared go back down. As far as I know, whatever was down there is still buried beneath the rubble, waiting. Would you be willing to help me if I decided to look into it properly? A real survey, done carefully, with proper safety this time." Bertram studied her for a long time, his expression somewhere between doubt and something that looked almost like hope. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Miss Marchetti. Perhaps I'm both, she said, echoing the Duke's own words from the day before without realizing it. He finally nodded, slowly. I'll help you look, but we do this carefully. No rushing. Not like last time. Walking home that afternoon, Elena felt something she had not felt in a long while, a flicker of purpose beneath the fear. She still did not know what waited for her at Ravenscar Quarry. She did not know if Bertram's warning about unstable ground would prove true, or if there truly was something valuable buried beneath the collapsed wall. But for the first time since receiving that strange, unsettling deed, she felt certain of one thing. She was not going to let fear write the ending of this story before she had even begun it. As she reached the edge of town, she looked north, toward the distant gray hills where the quarry waited, silent and patient, holding its secrets a little longer. Tomorrow, she decided, she would go and see it for herself. The road to Ravenscar Quarry had not been maintained in 10 years. Weeds pushed up through the old cart tracks, and the wooden signpost that once marked the turn had rotted through and fallen sideways into the ditch. Elena walked it alone at dawn, a lantern in one hand and Bertram's hand-drawn map in the other, her breath visible in the cold morning air. She had told no one the exact hour she planned to leave. Margaret would have insisted on coming, and Elena did not want to put her friend in danger before she understood what kind of danger it truly was. Bertram had offered to walk with her as far as the entrance, but his knees no longer allowed him to climb the steep final stretch, so he had given her careful instructions instead, along with a small brass whistle to carry, in case she needed to signal for help. As she crested the last hill, the quarry came into view, and for a moment, Elena simply stood still, taking it in. It was larger than she had imagined, a wide, scarred bowl cut into the hillside, its walls a mixture of pale limestone and darker, reddish rock she did not recognize. Broken carts and rusted tools lay scattered near the entrance, exactly where they had been abandoned a decade earlier, as though the workers had fled mid-task and never looked back. A section of the eastern wall had clearly given way at some point, leaving a jagged slope of loose rubble that stretched down into shadow. The silence was the strangest part. No birds sang here. No wind moved through the dry grass at the quarry's edge. It felt as though the entire place was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. Elena took a steadying breath and stepped through the entrance. Inside, the air grew cooler, and the light dimmed as the high stone walls rose up around her. She lit her lantern and moved carefully along the main path, careful to avoid the loose stone near the collapsed section. Bertram had warned her to stay well clear of the eastern ridge until proper supports could be installed, and she intended to honor that promise, at least for today. She began exploring the western side instead, where the old mining platforms still stood, weathered but intact. Rusted chains hung from wooden beams overhead. A few abandoned lanterns sat where they had been left, their glass cracked, their oil long since dried away. It was here, examining one of the old support beams, that she first noticed the strange markings in the rock. At first, she thought it was simply a natural pattern, some kind of mineral vein running through the limestone. But as she brought her lantern closer, she realized the striations were far too regular to be accidental. Thin, silvery lines ran through the darker rock in an almost rhythmic pattern, catching the lantern light in a way that made them appear to shimmer faintly, like something alive beneath the surface. She had seen nothing like it in any of the county's old mining records. Elena pulled a small notebook from her satchel and began sketching the pattern as carefully as she could, noting its location, the depth of the vein where it was visible, and the surrounding rock composition. She worked for nearly 2 hours, moving slowly along the western wall, documenting every place the strange stone appeared. At one point, her lantern light caught something else, a series of old chisel marks near the base of one platform, deliberately cut rather than naturally formed. Someone had tried to extract a sample of this stone before the collapse. She traced the marks with her fingers, wondering who had made them, and whether that person had been one of the 6 men lost that day. By midday, she had filled nearly half her notebook. She sat on an overturned cart to rest and eat the small meal she had packed, staring out at the quiet expanse of the quarry. It was strange, she thought, how a place that had caused so much fear could also feel so still, almost peaceful, when approached with patience instead of panic. As she was packing away her notebook to head back toward town, she noticed something near the collapsed eastern section that made her pause. Half buried beneath a pile of loose rubble, barely visible in the afternoon light, was a large, dark stone fragment, clearly broken away from something larger. Its surface, even coated in dust, held the same silvery striations she had been sketching all morning, but far more pronounced. She approached carefully, staying well outside the unstable slope, and used a long stick to nudge the loose dirt away from the fragment's edge. What she uncovered made her breath catch. The stone was unlike any limestone she had ever seen. It was denser, heavier looking despite its size, and where the sunlight touched its surface, it seemed to hold a faint, warm glow, as though the light itself lingered inside it, a moment longer than it should. She carefully lifted the fragment, surprised by its weight, and turned it over in her hands. On its underside, faint tool marks suggested it had indeed been cut deliberately, not simply broken loose by the collapse. This was the vein Bertram had spoken of. This was what the miners had been pulling from the ground the day the wall came down. Elena wrapped the fragment carefully in a cloth from her satchel and placed it inside her bag, her mind racing with questions. If this stone was valuable, truly valuable, it could explain everything. The rushed digging, the pressure from outside overseers, even the refusal to properly investigate the collapse afterward. Someone had wanted this stone badly enough to risk lives for it. She spent the rest of the afternoon documenting the collapse section from a safe distance, sketching the slope, noting where the rubble seemed thickest, and marking areas that might require careful clearing once proper support beams could be installed. By the time the sun began sinking toward the western hills, she had filled her entire notebook, and her legs ached from hours of careful, cautious movement across uneven ground. As she made her way back toward the entrance, exhaustion mixing with excitement in a way she had never quite felt before, she noticed something odd near the old cart tracks outside the quarry. Fresh footprints. Not her own, and far too recent to belong to any of the original miners from a decade ago. They led away from the quarry entrance and disappeared into the tall grass toward the eastern road. The same road that led, she realized with a slow chill, toward the Cartwright family's land. Elena stood still for a long moment, studying the prints, her earlier excitement now tangled with a new, sharper unease. Someone else had been here recently. Someone who had not wanted to be seen. She thought of Bertram's words from the day before, about overseers who answered to men outside the county, men who had wanted the vein pulled quickly regardless of the cost. She thought of the whispered rumors in town, always vague, always quick to blame ghosts and curses, rather than something as ordinary and dangerous as greed. By the time she reached Bertram's cottage that evening, the light was nearly gone, and her legs trembled with fatigue. She knocked twice before he answered, his face immediately etched with worry when he saw how pale she looked. "You found something," he said, more statement than question, as he ushered her inside. She unwrapped the stone fragment carefully and set it on his small table, watching his expression shift from curiosity to something far more serious as he studied it beneath the firelight. "I haven't seen stone like this in 30 years of mining," he said quietly, turning it slowly in his weathered hands. "Not since I was a young man working further south, in the old Baymouth quarries. You've seen this stone before?" "Once, a very long time ago. It was rare even then, valuable enough that entire fortunes were built and lost chasing it." He set the fragment down carefully, as though suddenly aware of its weight in more ways than one. "If this is truly the same vein running beneath Ravenscar, Miss Marchetti, you may be sitting on something far bigger than any of us realized." "There's something else," Elena said, her voice quieter now. "I found fresh footprints near the entrance. Someone else has been up there recently." Bertram's face hardened. "Then we are not the only ones who suspect what lies beneath that collapsed wall." Elena looked down at the strange, glowing fragment on the table between them, suddenly aware that the quiet, cautious work she had imagined for herself, careful surveys and patient documentation, might not stay quiet for very long. Whatever waited beneath Ravenscar Quarry, it seemed, others wanted it too, and they had already begun watching. Elena did not sleep well that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the fresh footprints leading away from the quarry, and the faint, warm glow of the stone fragment sitting wrapped in cloth beside her bed. By the time morning light crept through her window, she had already decided what needed to happen next. She could not simply hide the discovery and hope no one else came looking. If someone else already suspected the truth about the vein, then delay would only give them more time to act first. She dressed quickly and made her way toward Vance Manor, the stone fragment carefully wrapped and tucked inside her satchel. The servant who answered the door this time recognized her, and, after a brief hesitation, led her directly to the Duke's study, without requiring her to wait in the entrance hall. Duke Alessandro Vance looked up from his papers with visible surprise. "Miss Marchetti, I did not expect to see you again so soon." "Your Grace, I went to the quarry yesterday." His expression shifted immediately, concern replacing surprise. "Alone? After everything Bertram must have told you?" "I was careful. I stayed away from the unstable section, exactly as he instructed." She reached into her satchel and carefully unwrapped the stone fragment, placing it on his desk. "But I found something I believe you need to see." The Duke leaned forward, studying the fragment in the morning light streaming through his study window. His fingers hovered over its surface without quite touching it, as though he, too, sensed something unusual about the way the light seemed to linger within the stone. "What is this?" he asked quietly. "I don't know exactly, but Bertram recognized it. He said he saw stone like this once before, many years ago, in quarries far south of here. He believes it could be extremely valuable." The Duke sat back slowly in his chair, his eyes not leaving the fragment. "This is the vein the miners were following, the day the wall collapsed." "I believe so, yes." He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming lightly against the desk. 10 years, and no one thought to look closer. Everyone accepted the collapse as simple misfortune, and moved on, myself included. His voice carried a weight of old regret. "If this stone truly holds the value Bertram believes it does, it would explain a great deal that never made sense to me at the time." "There's something else, Your Grace," Elena said. "I found fresh footprints near the quarry entrance. Someone else has been there recently, and the tracks led toward the eastern road." His eyes sharpened at that. "Toward the Cartwright estate." "I believe so." The Duke rose from his chair and walked slowly to the window, staring out toward the distant hills, as he had done the day he first offered her the quarry. Edmund Cartwright has never hidden his ambition to control every profitable piece of land in this county. His family already owns the only functioning quarry left standing. If he suspected there was a valuable vein sitting untouched beneath Ravenscar, he would not hesitate to find a way to claim it for himself, deed or no deed. Even though the land is legally mine now. Legally, no. But men like Edmund Cartwright have never needed the law to move in their favor, when money and influence can move just as effectively. He turned back to face her. "You will need to move carefully from here, Miss Marchetti. If word spreads that there is real value in that quarry, you will not simply be dealing with frightened townsfolk and old ghost stories anymore." Elena nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his warning settle over her. "I want to bring in a geologist, someone who can properly identify this stone and determine how much of it truly remains beneath the collapsed section. Bertram has offered to help oversee the safety of any further digging, but I need someone with real expertise to confirm what we're truly dealing with." "And funding for such an effort?" "I know the estate's resources are limited," Elena said carefully. "I am not asking for much, only enough to bring in one trusted expert and secure the entrance properly against further collapse while we investigate." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, no longer simply the tired weight of a man giving away a burden, but something closer to genuine interest, perhaps even hope. "I have very little left to offer, Miss Marchetti, but what remains, I will risk on this. You have already shown more courage and clearer judgment in 2 days than most men in this county have shown in 10 years. Thank you, Your Grace." "There is a man named Walter Finch," the Duke said, "a retired geologist who once surveyed mineral deposits for the Crown, before settling quietly in the eastern hills. He is difficult, stubborn, and does not care for titles or formality, but his knowledge of rare stone formations is unmatched in this region. If anyone can properly identify what you have found, it is him. Would he be willing to help? I cannot say for certain, but I will write to him myself, and I suspect a personal request from me, paired with your discovery, may be enough to draw his curiosity out of retirement." 3 days later, Walter Finch arrived in town, an older man, with wild gray hair, ink-stained fingers, and an expression of deep skepticism that did not soften even after Elena carefully unwrapped the stone fragment before him. He examined it in silence for nearly 10 full minutes, turning it slowly under different angles of light, scratching at its surface gently with a small metal tool, and muttering things under his breath that Elena could not quite make out. Finally, he looked up, his skepticism replaced by something far more intense. "Where exactly did you find this?" "Ravenscar Quarry, near the collapsed eastern wall." "How much more do you believe remains?" "I don't know for certain. That's why we need you." Walter set the fragment down carefully, his hands trembling slightly with what Elena now recognized as excitement rather than age. "Miss Marchetti, if what I am looking at is what I believe it to be, this is not simply a valuable stone. This is one of the rarest formations I have encountered in over 30 years of studying mineral deposits across this entire region." "What is it?" "A dense variety of luminous marble, sometimes called moonstone marble by those who have encountered it before. Though true samples are exceedingly rare. It forms only under very specific conditions, deep pressure combined with mineral-rich groundwater over centuries. Architects prize it for its ability to hold light in a way ordinary stone cannot replicate. Jewelers value smaller cuttings for the same reason. A vein of significant size could be worth more than the rest of this county's combined assets." Elena felt the weight of his words settle slowly over her, both thrilling and frightening in equal measure. That would explain why the previous overseer pushed the miners so hard, and why the investigation into the collapse was closed so quickly afterward. "If someone recognized this stone for what it truly was," Walter said grimly, "and wished to control it without drawing attention or competition, causing enough fear to keep everyone else away from the site, would be remarkably effective." "You believe the collapse may not have been a simple accident?" Walter's expression grew serious. "I believe, Miss Marchetti, that you and I need to examine that eastern section very carefully, and very soon, before anyone else with less honest intentions decides to do the same." Bertram, upon hearing Walter's assessment, insisted that any further exploration proceed with proper wooden supports, installed along the unstable slope, refusing to allow anyone near the collapsed section until safety could be reasonably assured. It took nearly a week to gather the necessary materials and recruit 2 cautious workers willing to help install the supports, both older men who remembered the original collapse and trusted Bertram's judgment enough to return, despite their fear. When the day finally came to carefully begin clearing a narrow path into the edge of the rubble, Elena stood at the quarry entrance beside Walter and Bertram, watching the 2 workers begin their slow, careful task under Bertram's close supervision. It was tense, careful work. Each stone lifted and inspected before being set aside, every support beam tested twice before anyone trusted their weight against it. Elena found herself holding her breath more than once as loose rock shifted unexpectedly, though nothing more serious occurred than a small shower of dust and pebbles. By late afternoon, they had cleared enough of the rubble to reveal a narrow section of intact rock wall behind the collapse, and there, catching the fading daylight, ran a wide, unmistakable band of the same silvery, luminous stone Elena had found days earlier. Walter approached slowly, running his hand along its surface, his expression a mixture of scientific fascination and quiet disbelief. "This is far larger than the fragment you brought me," he said softly. "If this vein continues along the ridge as it appears to, Miss Marchetti, you may be looking at one of the most significant mineral discoveries this county has ever seen." Elena stood beside him, staring at the shimmering band of stone, feeling the full weight of what they had uncovered finally settle over her. It was no longer simply about proving herself, or defying the fear and ridicule of the town. Somewhere beneath this quiet, cursed hillside lay something powerful enough to rebuild fortunes, and dangerous enough that 6 men had already lost their lives protecting its secret. She only hoped that whoever else already suspected its existence would not act before she had the chance to secure it properly, and safely, for good. Word of the discovery could not stay contained for long, no matter how carefully Elena, Walter, and Bertram tried to keep their work quiet. 2 workers who had helped clear the rubble had families of their own, and even the most trusted men found it difficult to hide such news over a shared meal or a quiet drink after a long day's labor. Within 2 weeks, whispers had begun circulating through town that something valuable had been found at Ravenscar Quarry, though the details remained blurred and exaggerated with every retelling. Elena first noticed the change in how people looked at her. The pity and ridicule that had followed her since the Duke's announcement slowly gave way to something else: curiosity mixed with calculation. Shopkeepers, who once avoided her eyes, now greeted her warmly. Men who had laughed at her outside the blacksmith shop now tipped their hats respectfully as she passed. She found the shift unsettling rather than comforting. She understood, better than most, how quickly admiration could turn back into resentment, or worse, into greed disguised as friendship. It was Margaret who first warned her that the Cartwright family had also taken notice. "My cousin works in their kitchen," Margaret said one evening, sitting across from Elena at the small table in her rented room. "She says Lord Cartwright has been asking a great many questions about the quarry these past days. About you, specifically. Whether you have hired workers, what kind of stone has been found, whether the Duke has provided any funding." Elena's stomach tightened. How would he even know to ask such specific questions? "I don't know, but Elena, be careful. My cousin says his son Julian has been seen riding out toward the northern hills more than once these past weeks. Always alone, always in the early morning, before most of the household wakes." Elena thought immediately of the fresh footprints she had found near the quarry entrance on her very first visit. It seemed increasingly likely that the Cartwright family had already suspected something valuable lay beneath Ravenscar long before her own discovery, perhaps even before the Duke had offered her the deed at all. She resolved to bring this concern to the Duke as soon as possible, but before she could arrange a visit to the manor, Julian Cartwright arrived at the quarry entrance himself, unannounced, on a morning when Elena, Walter, and Bertram were carefully documenting the extent of the newly exposed vein. He rode up on a fine gray horse, dressed far too well for a casual visit to an abandoned mining site, his expression carrying the practiced charm of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through polite conversation rather than open confrontation. "Miss Marchetti," he said, dismounting smoothly. "What a pleasant surprise to find you out here, so far from town." "Mr. Cartwright," Elena replied carefully, stepping slightly in front of the newly exposed vein, though she knew the gesture likely did little to hide it from view. "I wasn't aware your family had business this far north." "No business at all, I assure you. Simply a morning ride." His eyes moved past her toward the exposed stone wall, lingering there a moment too long, before returning to her face. "Though I must say, I had heard rumors that something interesting was happening up here. It seems the rumors were not exaggerated. I'm not sure what you've heard, but this is simply a survey of old mining equipment, left behind after the collapse. Nothing more." Julian smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. "Of course. Though I would think old equipment would hardly require the attention of a geologist of Walter Finch's reputation." He glanced toward Walter, who returned the look with open suspicion, rather than any attempt at politeness. "My father has always taken a great interest in the mineral wealth of this county, Miss Marchetti. If you were to find anything of genuine value up here, I'm certain he would be most eager to discuss a fair arrangement, one that could benefit us both considerably. I appreciate the thought, Mr. Cartwright, but the quarry belongs to me by the Duke's own legal deed. Any arrangements regarding its future will be decisions I make myself." Something flickered across Julian's face then, brief but unmistakable, the practiced charm slipping just enough to reveal a colder calculation underneath. "Of course," he said again, his tone still light. "Though deeds, like fortunes, have a way of changing hands when circumstances shift, I hope, for your sake, that circumstances remain favorable to you." He mounted his horse, without waiting for a response, and rode off toward the eastern road, leaving Elena standing at the quarry entrance, with a growing unease she could not quite shake. "That was not a friendly visit," Bertram said quietly, once Julian was well out of sight. "No," Elena agreed. "It wasn't." That evening, Elena rode to Vance Manor to inform the Duke of what had happened. He listened in grim silence as she recounted Julian's veiled threat, his expression darkening with each detail. "This is precisely what I feared," he said, once she had finished. "Edmund Cartwright has never needed subtlety, when patience would serve him just as well. If his son has already begun making such visits, it means the family suspects the true value of what you've found, and they will not simply wait for you to fail on your own. What can we do?" The Duke considered for a long moment before answering. "We need to move more quickly than I had originally planned. A full, proper survey, documented and witnessed by respected parties outside this county, would make it far more difficult for anyone to challenge your legal claim later. I also believe it would be wise to bring the county council into this discussion sooner rather than later, before Edmund Cartwright has the chance to shape the narrative in his own favor first. Won't that risk drawing even more attention before we're ready? Perhaps. But secrecy has already begun slipping through our fingers, Miss Marchetti. Better to control what information reaches the council ourselves than to leave that task to men with far less honest intentions. Over the following weeks, Elena, Walter, and Bertram worked tirelessly to properly document the full extent of the exposed vein, carefully mapping its path along the ridge, testing samples for purity, and recording every measurement with meticulous care. Walter proved himself invaluable, not only for his scientific expertise, but for his stubborn insistence on accuracy over speed, refusing to let Elena rush any part of the process, despite the growing pressure surrounding them. It was during this careful work that Elena first noticed small signs of interference. A section of rope they had left secured near the entrance one evening was found cut through the following morning. A crate of sample tools went missing entirely one night, only to reappear mysteriously 2 days later, though several tools inside had clearly been tampered with, their edges dulled beyond normal use. Bertram grew increasingly watchful, insisting they post a rotating night watch near the quarry entrance, though none of them could afford to lose sleep for long, without their careful work suffering during daylight hours. Then, one morning, Elena arrived to find Walter standing near the entrance, his face pale with barely contained anger, gesturing toward a section of their carefully installed wooden supports along the unstable slope. "Someone was here last night," he said grimly. "Look at this." Elena approached and saw immediately what had alarmed him. Several of the support beams they had spent days carefully positioning had been deliberately loosened, their bracing weakened in a way that would have caused significant collapse had anyone attempted to work beneath them without noticing the tampering first. "If we hadn't checked these before beginning today's work," Walter said quietly, "someone could have been seriously hurt, or worse." Elena felt cold fury replace her earlier unease. This was no longer simply veiled threats and unsettling visits. Someone was actively trying to sabotage their efforts, and willing to risk lives to do it. "We need to tell the Duke immediately," she said, "and we need proof of who is responsible, before anyone else gets hurt." Bertram, examining the tampered supports more closely, pointed toward a faint boot print pressed into the soft earth nearby, far too fresh to belong to any of their own small team. "Whoever did this," he said grimly, "was careless enough to leave a trail. If we're fortunate, that carelessness may be exactly what proves their guilt." Elena looked toward the eastern road, toward the direction Julian Cartwright had ridden only weeks before, and felt a hardening resolve settle over her earlier fear. If the Cartwright family believed intimidation and sabotage would drive her away from what was rightfully hers, they had badly misjudged the woman they were dealing with. The boot print near the tampered supports became the first solid piece of evidence in what Elena now understood was a deliberate effort to stop her work before it could truly begin. She carefully measured its dimensions and sketched its distinctive tread pattern into her notebook, unusual enough that it might later be matched against a specific pair of boots, should the opportunity ever arise to compare them. Bertram insisted on doubling their night watch after the sabotage, taking the first shift himself despite his age, refusing to hear any argument against it. Walter, meanwhile, threw himself into completing a thorough written report of the vein's extent and composition, working late into each night by lamplight, determined to have undeniable scientific documentation ready before anyone could challenge their findings. Elena spent her days assisting where she could, but her mind kept returning to Julian Cartwright's veiled words at the quarry entrance. Deeds, like fortunes, have a way of changing hands when circumstances shift. It had sounded less like an idle observation, and more like a promise of exactly what his family intended to attempt. She decided it was time to understand the full history of what had happened 10 years earlier, not simply the vague official account, but the detailed truth of who had overseen the original mining efforts, and who had benefited most from the investigation's hasty conclusion. She returned to the county records office, a small, dusty building she had visited countless times during her years as a bookkeeper, though never with quite this urgency. The elderly clerk, Harriet Bloom, greeted her warmly, having always appreciated Elena's careful, respectful treatment of the county's fragile old documents. "I need to see the original ownership and oversight records for Ravenscar Quarry," Elena explained. "Everything from the years leading up to the collapse." Harriet led her to a back room lined with tall shelves of aging ledgers, pulling down several thick volumes covered in a fine layer of dust. These haven't been requested in years, dear. Not since the original investigation, as far as I recall. Elena spent the better part of 2 days working through the old records, cross-referencing names, dates, and financial transactions, with the same careful patience she had once applied to balancing the estate's troubled accounts. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge from the tangled details. 10 years earlier, the quarry's daily operations had been overseen not by a Vance family employee directly, but by a contracted overseer named Percival Grant, a name Elena did not recognize from any of the county's current business dealings. Further digging revealed that Percival Grant had, at the time, also held a separate, smaller contract with the Cartwright family's growing quarry operations to the east, a connection that had never been mentioned in any of the official collapse investigation documents. More troubling still, financial records showed a substantial, unexplained payment made to Percival Grant only weeks before the collapse, its source listed only as a private northern account, with no further detail provided. Shortly after the collapse and the investigation's swift closure, Percival Grant had left the county entirely, and the Cartwright family's own quarry operations had shown a notable and unexplained increase in output within the following year. Elena sat back from the ledgers, her pulse quickening. It was not absolute proof, not yet, but it strongly suggested that someone connected to the Cartwright family had paid Percival Grant to push the miners into dangerous, hurried extraction of the very vein Elena had now rediscovered, likely hoping to secure a large quantity of the valuable stone quickly and quietly, before anyone else understood its worth. When the collapse occurred and killed several miners, the investigation had been closed swiftly, perhaps to avoid drawing attention to exactly this kind of connection. She copied every relevant detail into her notebook and thanked Harriet warmly, before hurrying to share her findings with the Duke. Duke Alessandro Vance listened with growing intensity as Elena laid out what she had discovered, his expression shifting from surprise to something colder, more resolute, as the full implications became clear. "Percival Grant," he said slowly, once she had finished. "I remember the name now, though only vaguely. He was recommended to my father at the time by a business associate, someone I never had reason to question closely. If he was secretly working for the Cartwright family as well, accepting payment to push our own miners into dangerous conditions for their benefit, it would explain a great deal that never made sense to me." "It doesn't prove Edmund Cartwright himself ordered it," Elena said carefully, "but it strongly suggests the connection was there, and that his family profited from what happened. It is enough, at the very least, to demand a proper reopening of that investigation," the Duke said, "particularly now that we understand exactly what was at stake beneath that collapsed wall. There's something else I need to ask you, Your Grace." Elena hesitated only briefly before continuing. "The sabotage at the quarry, the tampered supports, the missing tools. If the Cartwright family is willing to risk further harm now simply to slow our work, I worry what they might attempt once they realize a formal survey and investigation are underway." The Duke's expression grew serious. "You are right to be cautious. I will arrange for additional trusted men to help guard the site properly, not simply a rotating night watch among your small team, but proper security, paid through what remains of the estate's resources. This matter has moved beyond something you should have to protect alone." Over the following days, the Duke arranged for 2 former estate guards, retired but still capable, to join the rotating watch at the quarry, easing some of the pressure on Bertram, and allowing Elena and Walter to focus more fully on completing their survey work. It was during this period that Walter finally completed his full written report, a thorough, carefully documented account of the vein's composition, extent, and estimated value, supported by detailed sketches and sample analysis that left little room for scientific doubt. "This vein runs deeper and wider than I initially estimated," Walter explained, spreading his notes across Elena's small table one evening. "Based on what we've been able to safely expose so far, and the pattern of the surrounding rock formation, I believe it likely continues for a considerable distance beneath the hillside, perhaps far beyond what caused the original collapse." "How much would it truly be worth?" Walter considered carefully before answering. "It is difficult to say precisely without further extraction, but if the vein proves as extensive as I suspect, this discovery alone could represent more wealth than this entire county has generated collectively in the past decade." Elena sat with that knowledge for a long moment, feeling its weight settle over her, in a way that was equal parts thrilling and deeply sobering. It was no longer simply about proving her own worth, or even about protecting what the Duke had entrusted to her. If Walter's assessment proved accurate, this discovery held the potential to transform the fortunes of everyone in the surrounding county. Workers who had struggled for years under the weight of the estate's declining finances, families who had watched opportunities dwindle year after year as the old industries slowly failed around them. But that same potential made the stakes surrounding its control immeasurably higher, and Elena understood, with growing clarity, that the Cartwright family would not simply walk away now that the truth of the vein's value had begun surfacing. Whatever came next, she suspected, would test not only her careful patience, but her willingness to fight, openly and without hesitation, for what rightfully belonged to her, and to the people who stood to benefit most from its careful, honest development. She only hoped the proof they had gathered so far would be enough, when the moment finally came to defend it. The additional guards the Duke arranged proved their worth sooner than anyone expected. Only 4 nights after they began their rotation, one of the men, a broad-shouldered former estate guard named Owen Pratt, caught sight of 2 figures attempting to approach the quarry entrance well after midnight, moving carefully to avoid the moonlight. Owen shouted a warning, and the figures fled immediately into the darkness, disappearing along the eastern road before he could catch them or identify their faces clearly. But in their hurried retreat, they left behind a canvas sack containing several tools, clearly intended for quiet, unauthorized digging, along with a folded piece of paper bearing a rough, hand-drawn map of the quarry's interior, including the exact location of the exposed vein. Elena examined the map carefully the following morning, her unease deepening with every detail she recognized. Whoever had drawn it clearly understood precisely where the valuable stone lay, information that had only been confirmed through her own careful survey work over the past several weeks. "Someone has been watching our work closely enough to map this out themselves," Bertram said grimly, studying the paper over her shoulder. "Or someone within our own circle has been sharing information they shouldn't." The thought had already occurred to Elena, though she hated to consider it. She trusted Bertram and Walter completely, and the 2 workers who had helped clear the rubble had proven their loyalty many times over. But the guards were new additions, hired quickly under pressure, and she could not yet be certain of their full loyalty. She brought the map and canvas sack directly to the Duke, along with Owen's account of the attempted late-night intrusion. "This changes things considerably," the Duke said, studying the map with a deepening frown. "This is no longer simply intimidation or minor sabotage. This is an attempt at outright theft, and a bold one at that." "I believe it's time to bring this matter before the county council," Elena said. "Not simply the sabotage, but everything. The connection between Percival Grant and the Cartwright family, the original collapse, and now this attempted intrusion. If we wait longer, hoping to gather even more proof, I worry they may attempt something even more drastic." The Duke nodded slowly. "I agree. I will request a formal hearing before the council as soon as possible. But Miss Marchetti, understand that Edmund Cartwright has considerable influence among several council members. This will not be a simple matter of presenting evidence and receiving immediate justice. He will fight this with every resource available to him. Then we will need every piece of proof we can gather beforehand," Elena said firmly, "and I believe I know exactly where to look for more." She returned once again to Harriet Bloom at the county records office, this time asking to see any documentation related to the Cartwright family's own quarry output over the past decade. Hoping to find further evidence of the unexplained increase in production Elena had noticed during her earlier research. Harriet, sensing the seriousness in Elena's request, retrieved the relevant ledgers without hesitation, though she cautioned quietly, "Be careful how you use these records, dear. Lord Cartwright has friends among the council who would not take kindly to their family's business being scrutinized so closely." Elena worked through the records meticulously, cross-referencing production numbers against known market prices for ordinary limestone extraction, searching for any discrepancy that might suggest the Cartwright family had been quietly selling something far more valuable than their official records indicated. She found what she needed in a series of shipping manifests dated shortly after the original Ravenscar collapse, listing unusually small crates, transported under heavy security, to buyers outside the county, described only vaguely as specialty architectural stone, at prices far exceeding what ordinary limestone could ever command. The timing aligned precisely with the period immediately following the collapse, suggesting the Cartwright family had indeed managed to extract and sell a smaller quantity of the valuable vein before the site was fully abandoned. Armed with this new evidence, alongside Walter's detailed geological report and the recovered map from the attempted intrusion, Elena and the Duke finally submitted their formal request for a county council hearing, outlining the full scope of what they intended to present. News of the upcoming hearing spread through town almost immediately, and with it, the town's earlier mixture of curiosity and calculation shifted once again, this time towards something closer to genuine concern. Many families in the county had quietly struggled under the weight of the Cartwright family's growing influence over local business and land dealings for years, and the possibility that their wrongdoing might finally be exposed stirred a cautious hope among many who had long felt powerless against them. But not everyone welcomed the news. Elena received an unexpected visit at her rented room only 2 days before the scheduled hearing, this time from Lord Edmund Cartwright himself, arriving without warning, accompanied only by his son Julian. She invited them in cautiously, watching Edmund Cartwright's sharp, calculating eyes take careful stock of her modest surroundings. "Miss Marchetti," he began, his voice smooth and measured, carrying none of his son's earlier attempt at charm, but something far colder and more direct instead. "I understand you intend to bring certain accusations before the county council regarding my family's business dealings. I intend to present evidence, Lord Cartwright. Whatever conclusions the council draws from that evidence will be their own." "Evidence," he repeated, a faint, humorless smile crossing his face. "Old records, easily misinterpreted by someone eager to see connections that may not truly exist. A stolen map that could have been drawn by anyone, with a passing familiarity with that quarry's layout. Circumstantial details, nothing more." "Then you have nothing to fear from a proper hearing," Elena said evenly. Something flickered behind his calm expression then, brief but unmistakable. "I would advise you to reconsider proceeding, Miss Marchetti. My family has considerable resources and considerable patience, both of which I would rather not need to exercise against someone as young and, forgive me, as inexperienced as yourself in matters such as these." "Is that a threat, Lord Cartwright?" "It is simply practical advice," he said smoothly, rising from his seat. "Offered, I assure you, with your own best interests in mind." He left shortly after, Julian following silently behind him, though Elena caught the younger man glancing back at her once from the doorway, his expression unreadable, somewhere between reluctant admiration and quiet unease. Once they were gone, Elena sat alone for a long while, her heart still pounding from the tension of the encounter. She thought of Bertram's warning about the men who had once pressured the original miners into dangerous, hurried work, and of the 6 lives lost as a direct result of that pressure. She thought of the small, valuable crates shipped quietly out of the county under heavy security, evidence of exactly how far the Cartwright family had already been willing to go in pursuit of this same stone. Whatever careful, practical advice Edmund Cartwright believed he had offered her, Elena understood it for exactly what it truly was, a warning, delivered directly, from a man who had far more to lose than he wished to admit. She would not back down now. Not after everything she and her small, trusted team had already uncovered, but she understood, with sharpening clarity, that the coming hearing would likely be far more dangerous and far more consequential than she had originally allowed herself to imagine. In the 2 days remaining before the hearing, Elena worked almost without rest, reviewing every piece of evidence alongside Walter and the Duke, determined to present their case with absolute clarity and precision. Bertram, meanwhile, kept a careful watch over the quarry itself, unwilling to leave the site unguarded so close to a hearing that could determine its future once and for all. It was during this final stretch of preparation that Bertram made a discovery that would prove pivotal to everything that followed. While reviewing old crates of abandoned equipment near the quarry's original supply shed, searching for anything that might further support their case, Bertram uncovered a small, hidden compartment beneath the shed's warped wooden floorboards, clearly built with deliberate care to conceal something from casual discovery. Inside, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth to protect against moisture, he found a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with the careful, cramped handwriting of the very man Elena had been researching for weeks, Percival Grant himself. Bertram brought the journal to Elena immediately, his hands trembling slightly with the significance of what he had found. Elena spent that entire night reading through its pages by candlelight, her breath catching more than once, as the full truth of what had happened 10 years earlier finally emerged in Percival Grant's own hand. The journal confirmed everything Elena had suspected and more. Percival Grant had indeed been secretly employed by Edmund Cartwright, tasked specifically with identifying valuable mineral deposits within the Vance family's land holdings, while officially overseeing operations on their behalf. Upon discovering the luminous marble vein beneath Ravenscar's eastern ridge, he had reported the finding directly to Cartwright, who had instructed him to extract as much of the valuable stone as quickly and quietly as possible, using minimal safety precautions to save both time and cost, intending to sell the extracted stone through private channels before the Vance family or anyone else in the county understood its true worth. The journal detailed, in chilling clarity, Grant's own private concerns about the unsafe pace of extraction in the weeks leading up to the collapse, concerns he had raised directly with Cartwright, only to be dismissed, and pressured to continue, regardless of the risk to the miners, working beneath increasingly unstable conditions. Following the collapse itself, the journal described a hurried, private meeting between Grant and Cartwright, during which Cartwright had arranged for a substantial payment to ensure Grant's swift and permanent departure from the county, alongside quiet assurances that the official investigation would be closed quickly, using Cartwright's own influence among certain council members to prevent any deeper scrutiny into the true cause of the disaster. The final pages of the journal, dated shortly before Grant's departure, revealed a man wrestling visibly with guilt over the lives lost under his oversight. Guilt he had apparently chosen to bury alongside his career, rather than expose the truth and risk Cartwright's considerable wrath. Elena closed the journal carefully near dawn, her exhaustion now mixed with a grim, steady resolve. This was no longer simply circumstantial evidence, open to alternative interpretation. This was direct, damning proof, written in the very hand of the man who had overseen the tragedy himself. She brought the journal to the Duke immediately, watching his expression shift through disbelief, anger, and finally, a quiet, resolute determination as he read through its most damning passages himself. "This changes everything," he said finally. "With this, alongside everything else we've gathered, the council will have no reasonable choice but to act decisively against Edmund Cartwright. We need to consider how best to present this," Elena said carefully. "If Cartwright suspects the full weight of evidence we now hold against him, I fear he may attempt something desperate before the hearing even takes place. Then we will need to protect this journal, and you, most carefully, until that day arrives," the Duke said. "I will arrange additional security immediately, both here and at the quarry itself." That protection proved necessary sooner than either of them expected. Only one night before the scheduled hearing, Elena woke suddenly, in the darkness of her rented room, startled by the unmistakable sound of a window latch being carefully forced from outside. She rose silently, her heart pounding, and reached for the small brass whistle Bertram had given her weeks earlier, still kept close beside her bed out of habit. Before she could act further, the window swung open, and a dark figure began climbing quietly through, clearly searching for something specific within the room. Elena blew the whistle as loudly as she could manage, the sharp, piercing sound cutting through the night's silence. The intruder froze for a brief moment, startled, before quickly abandoning the attempt and disappearing back through the window into the darkness outside, footsteps fading rapidly down the street. Margaret, who had insisted on staying with Elena during these final tense days, despite Elena's earlier objections, rushed into the room moments later, her face pale with alarm. "Elena, are you hurt?" "No," Elena said, her voice shaking slightly, despite her best effort to remain calm. "Whoever it was left before I could see their face. But Margaret, they were looking for something specific. I'm certain of it." Together, they carefully checked the room, and Elena's stomach tightened when she confirmed what she had already feared. The satchel containing Percival Grant's journal, thankfully, remained secure exactly where she had hidden it, beneath a loose floorboard the previous evening, a precaution she had taken instinctively after Bertram's earlier warning about the sabotage at the quarry. Whoever had attempted to break in that night had clearly been searching for the very evidence that now stood ready to expose the truth before the entire county council. The following morning, shaken but resolute, Elena met with the Duke and Walter one final time before the hearing, recounting the night's events in careful detail. "This confirms exactly how desperate Cartwright has become," the Duke said grimly. He knows what we hold against him, or at the very least, suspects it strongly enough to risk such a reckless attempt. Then we go before the council today, Elena said firmly, and we ensure that whatever else happens, the truth of what occurred at Ravenscar Quarry can never again be buried beneath fear, silence, or anyone's carefully protected reputation. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something close to genuine admiration crossing his tired features. You have shown remarkable courage throughout this entire ordeal, Miss Marchetti. Whatever the council ultimately decides today, know that you have already accomplished something far greater than simply proving your own worth. You have uncovered a truth that should have been brought to light 10 long years ago. Elena nodded, steadying her resolve as best she could. Whatever awaited them at the county hall that afternoon, she intended to walk in prepared to fight, with every piece of evidence, every carefully gathered testimony, and every ounce of quiet determination she had built over these past exhausting, transformative weeks. The truth, at long last, was ready to be told. Before the hearing began that afternoon, Elena made one final stop, one she felt was every bit as important as the evidence she carried carefully folded within her satchel. She walked to the small square near the center of town, where many of the county's out-of-work miners still gathered each morning, hoping for whatever odd labor they could find to support their families, since Ravenscar's collapse had taken away their livelihood a decade earlier. Word had already spread that something significant was happening with the old quarry, and a small crowd had gathered even before Elena arrived, drawn by curiosity and the quiet hope that perhaps, after all these fearful years, something good might finally come from that cursed hillside. Samuel Ashford, one of the few surviving miners who had worked at Ravenscar before the collapse, stood near the front of the gathered crowd, his weathered face carrying both curiosity and deep, guarded caution. "Miss Marchetti," he said as she approached, "folks are saying you found something valuable up there. Something worth all this trouble with the Cartwrights." "I have," Elena said honestly, addressing not just Samuel, but the entire gathered crowd. "A vein of rare stone, valuable enough to change the fortunes of this entire county, if it's managed honestly and carefully." A murmur rippled through the crowd, equal parts hope and skepticism. "And what happens to us?" Samuel asked. "The men who once worked that ground, who lost friends and family the day it collapsed. Are we simply meant to watch from a distance while others profit from what cost us so dearly?" Elena had thought carefully about exactly this question in the days leading up to this moment. "No," she said firmly. "If the council rules in my favor today, and the quarry's future is secured properly, I intend to hire local workers first, with fair wages and proper safety measures this time, unlike before. More than that, I intend to offer a share of the quarry's profits to those willing to help rebuild it, not simply wages for labor, but a genuine stake in its success." Samuel studied her carefully, searching her face for any sign of empty promise. "You would trust men who fled that ground in fear to return and work it again? I would trust men who understand exactly what went wrong before, and who deserve the chance to help make it right this time, with proper care and proper respect for the risks involved. I cannot promise there is no danger in mining, but I can promise it will never again be approached with the same careless greed that caused the collapse 10 years ago." A long silence followed her words, the crowd exchanging uncertain glances among themselves. Finally, an older woman near the back of the gathering spoke up, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "My husband was one of the 6 lost that day," she said, her voice steady despite the visible grief still carried in her eyes. "I have waited 10 years for someone, anyone, to tell me the truth of what truly happened to him. If you are willing to fight for that truth today, Miss Marchetti, then you have my support, whatever comes of it." Others began nodding in agreement, the crowd's earlier skepticism slowly softening into something closer to cautious hope. Samuel Ashford, after a long moment of consideration, finally extended his hand toward her. "If the council rules in your favor," he said, "you'll have willing hands, ready to help rebuild that quarry properly. You have my word on that." Elena shook his hand firmly, feeling a surge of quiet emotion at the trust being placed in her by people who had suffered so greatly from the very ground she now fought to protect and transform. She arrived at the county hall shortly after, joined by the Duke, Walter, and Bertram, all 4 of them carrying between them the careful weight of weeks of exhausting, dangerous work. The hall itself was already crowded far beyond its usual capacity, word of the hearing having drawn attention from across the entire county. Curious townsfolk filling every available seat and lining the walls in anticipation of what promised to be a dramatic confrontation. Councilman Percy Whitfield, presiding over the hearing, called the room to order as Edmund and Julian Cartwright arrived shortly after, both dressed impeccably, their expressions carefully composed despite the obvious tensions simmering beneath the surface. Duke Alessandro Vance rose first, addressing the gathered council with the calm, measured authority of a man long accustomed to formal proceedings, though Elena could see the quiet tension in his tightly clasped hands as he began. "Members of the council," he began, 10 years ago, a tragedy occurred at Ravenscar Quarry that this county accepted, far too quickly, as simple misfortune. Today, we bring forward evidence suggesting that tragedy was not misfortune at all, but the direct result of deliberate, reckless greed, and we ask this council to finally reopen that investigation and to recognize the rightful, legal ownership of the quarry and its valuable resources as belonging entirely to Miss Elena Marchetti, under the deed I granted her myself. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowded hall, and Elena felt every eye in the room shift toward her, the weight of the moment settling heavily across her shoulders. Beside her, Walter clutched his detailed geological report tightly, and within her own satchel, carefully protected, sat Percival Grant's damning journal, ready to reveal the truth the Cartwright family had spent 10 long years trying desperately to keep buried. Whatever happened next, Elena understood, would determine not only her own future, but the future of every family in this county, still living in the long shadow of Ravenscar's tragic, unresolved past. Edmund Cartwright rose slowly once the Duke had finished speaking, his composure unshaken, his voice carrying the smooth, practiced confidence of a man who had spent decades navigating rooms exactly like this one. "Members of the council," he began, "I have known Duke Vance for many years, and I have always respected his judgment. But I must express deep concern that grief and old, painful memories are being used here to cast baseless suspicion upon my family's honest business dealings. The collapse at Ravenscar was a tragic accident, thoroughly investigated at the time by qualified officials. I failed to see what new evidence could possibly justify reopening such a settled matter, particularly evidence gathered by an inexperienced young bookkeeper with, forgive me, an obvious personal stake in seeing her own newly acquired property appear more valuable than it perhaps truly is." A few scattered murmurs of agreement rippled through certain sections of the crowd, and Elena noticed several council members exchanging uncertain glances, clearly swayed, at least partially, by Cartwright's calm, confident dismissal. Councilman Whitfield turned toward Elena. "Miss Marchetti, you have brought this matter before us. I trust you have evidence beyond simple suspicion to support such serious accusations." Elena rose steadily, drawing a deep breath before addressing the room. "I do, Councilman Whitfield. I would ask the council's patience as I lay out exactly what myself and my colleagues have uncovered these past several weeks." She began methodically, first presenting Walter's detailed geological survey, confirming the presence of an extraordinarily valuable vein of luminous marble running beneath Ravenscar's eastern ridge, a discovery that alone explained why the original extraction had been pushed forward with such reckless urgency. Walter rose to support her presentation, addressing several pointed, skeptical questions from council members regarding his findings with calm, patient expertise that left little room for reasonable doubt about the stone's genuine value. Next, Elena presented the county's own shipping records, carefully highlighting the unusual, heavily secured crates transported from Cartwright family holdings shortly after the collapse, sold at prices far exceeding ordinary limestone, precisely matching the timeline of the original tragedy. Edmund Cartwright's composed expression tightened slightly at this, though he remained otherwise still, watching carefully as Elena continued building her case piece by careful piece. Finally, Elena withdrew Percival Grant's leather-bound journal from her satchel, holding it up for the council to see clearly. "This journal belonged to Percival Grant," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "the very overseer responsible for operations at Ravenscar Quarry at the time of the collapse. In his own hand, he documents being secretly employed by Lord Cartwright to identify valuable mineral deposits within the Vance family's land, and describes being explicitly instructed to extract the discovered vein as quickly as possible, disregarding proper safety measures, in order to profit privately, before anyone else understood its true value. Gasps rippled visibly through the crowded hall. Councilman Whitfield leaned forward sharply. "May I see this journal directly, Miss Marchetti?" Elena handed it forward carefully, watching as Whitfield and several other council members reviewed its most damning passages themselves, their expressions shifting visibly, from skepticism to grave concern. Edmund Cartwright rose again, his earlier composure now visibly strained. "This journal proves nothing conclusively. Percival Grant was a disgruntled former employee, dismissed years ago for poor conduct. His private writings, whatever they may claim, are hardly reliable evidence against my family's reputation." "Then perhaps," Elena said calmly, "the council would find it useful to know that Mr. Grant's journal was discovered hidden, deliberately beneath the floorboards of the quarry's original supply shed, suggesting someone took great care to ensure it was never found. And perhaps the council would also find it relevant that only 2 nights ago, someone attempted to break into my own rented room, searching specifically for evidence, exactly like this journal, an attempt only prevented by pure chance." The hall fell into stunned silence at this revelation. Councilman Whitfield's expression hardened considerably as he turned back toward Edmund Cartwright. "Lord Cartwright, can you account for your whereabouts 2 nights past?" "I was at my estate, as always," Cartwright said, though for the first time, a slight edge of tension crept into his otherwise steady voice. "And your son?" Whitfield asked, turning his attention now toward Julian, who had remained notably silent throughout the entire proceeding. Julian hesitated, glancing briefly toward his father, before answering carefully. "I was also at the estate, Councilman." But Elena noticed something shift in Julian's expression then, a flicker of something that looked remarkably like guilt, or perhaps quiet relief, at finally being asked a direct question he could no longer avoid entirely. "Councilman Whitfield," Julian said suddenly, his voice steadier now, as though he had reached some difficult internal decision. "I would like to request a private word with the council, separate from my father's presence." Edmund Cartwright's head turned sharply toward his son. "Julian, this is neither the time nor—" "Father," Julian interrupted quietly, "I believe it is exactly the time." The hall buzzed with sudden, urgent murmurs as Councilman Whitfield, after a brief consultation with his fellow council members, granted Julian's request, calling for a short recess while Edmund Cartwright was asked, with visible reluctance, to step outside the immediate proceeding. What followed, spoken quietly but firmly before the remaining council members, changed the course of the entire hearing. Julian confessed that he had indeed ridden to the quarry, multiple times, in recent weeks, under his father's direct instruction, searching for confirmation of the vein's exact location. He further admitted, his voice heavy with visible guilt, that he had been present, though reluctantly, when his father arranged payment for the attempted late-night search of Elena's rented room, though he insisted he had not personally taken part in the intrusion itself, and had argued fiercely against it beforehand, out of genuine concern for Elena's safety. "I have spent years watching my father pursue wealth and influence, without regard for who it harmed along the way," Julian said quietly, addressing the council directly. "I did not fully understand the extent of what happened at Ravenscar 10 years ago, until Miss Marchetti's own investigation brought the truth to light. I cannot, in good conscience, continue protecting that truth any longer, whatever the cost to my own family's reputation." The hall remained in stunned silence as Julian's testimony settled over the room, followed shortly by scattered but growing applause from several sections of the crowd, particularly from those families who had waited 10 long years for exactly this kind of long-overdue acknowledgement. Councilman Whitfield called the room back to order, his expression now carrying the full, grave weight of the decision before him. "Given the substantial evidence presented today, including sworn testimony from Lord Cartwright's own son, this council finds sufficient grounds to formally reopen the investigation into the Ravenscar quarry collapse, and to fully recognize Miss Elena Marchetti's undisputed legal ownership of the quarry, and all resources contained within it." The hall erupted into a mixture of applause, relieved gasps, and murmured astonishment. Elena felt her legs nearly give way beneath her from the sheer release of tension. Months of fear, careful work, and quiet determination finally validated in this single, decisive moment. Duke Alessandro Vance turned toward her, his tired eyes now carrying something close to open pride. "You have done something remarkable today, Miss Marchetti. Something this county has needed for far longer than either of us fully realized." Across the hall, Edmund Cartwright stood rigid and pale, his carefully constructed composure finally, completely shattered, while beside him, his son Julian, met Elena's gaze steadily, something like quiet relief settling behind his tired eyes. The truth, buried for 10 long years beneath fear, greed, and careful silence, had finally been brought fully into the light. In the months that followed the hearing, Ravenscar Quarry transformed into something none of the county's residents could have imagined only a year earlier. With the council's formal recognition secured, and Percival Grant's confession serving as undeniable proof of the original tragedy's true cause, Elena moved quickly to honor the promise she had made to Samuel Ashford and the gathered crowd that fateful morning before the hearing. Proper safety measures were installed throughout the quarry, under Bertram's careful, experienced supervision, wooden supports reinforced with sturdy stone bracing, clear evacuation paths marked throughout the site, and strict limits placed on daily extraction to ensure no worker was ever again pushed beyond safe, reasonable limits in pursuit of speed or profit. Samuel Ashford returned to work the ground he had once fled in fear, this time as a trusted supervisor rather than simply another laborer, his deep knowledge of the quarry's layout proving invaluable as extraction slowly, carefully, began along the newly exposed vein. Alongside him came a dozen other former miners, many of whom had spent the past decade struggling to find steady work elsewhere in the county, now finally offered the fair wages and genuine profit sharing Elena had promised from the very beginning. Walter Finch, rather than returning to his quiet retirement in the Eastern Hills, agreed to stay on as the quarry's official geological advisor, overseeing extraction methods to ensure the valuable stone was harvested with the same careful precision he had brought to its initial discovery. As the first significant shipments of the rare luminous marble began reaching buyers beyond the county's borders, the profits proved even more substantial than Walter's earlier estimates had suggested. Architects and craftsmen from distant cities eagerly sought the stone for grand new building projects, drawn by its rare, warm glow unlike anything else available in the region. Within a year, the quarry's success had begun reshaping the entire county's fortunes. The Duke's estate, once teetering dangerously close to financial ruin, found itself restored through Elena's insistence on a fair, formal partnership agreement, one that recognized both her rightful ownership of the quarry and the Duke's contribution in first granting her the opportunity, along with his continued support throughout the difficult months that followed. New funds flowed into long-neglected roads, schools, and public buildings throughout the county, visible signs of recovery that touched nearly every family within its borders. Edmund Cartwright, facing formal charges related to the original collapse and the more recent attempts at sabotage and intrusion, saw his family's once considerable influence crumble rapidly under the weight of public scrutiny and legal consequence. His own quarry operations, already struggling under the shadow of scandal, were eventually sold off entirely, the proceeds used partly to compensate the families of the 6 miners lost in the original tragedy. A small but meaningful measure of justice, arriving 10 years too late, though deeply appreciated nonetheless by those who had waited so long for any acknowledgement at all. Julian Cartwright, having chosen honesty over blind loyalty to his father during the hearing, found himself estranged from much of his family's remaining fortune and influence, though he took the difficult transition with a quiet, determined grace that surprised many in the county who had once viewed him with open suspicion. He eventually took a modest position within the newly restructured quarry operations himself, working diligently, without complaint, as though determined to earn back through honest labor what his family's reputation had cost so many others. Elena, meanwhile, found her own life transformed in ways she could scarcely have imagined during those early, frightening days when the town had openly mocked her for accepting what everyone assumed was a worthless, cursed inheritance. She was no longer viewed as simply the estate's quiet bookkeeper, nor as the foolish young woman who had taken on a burden no one else would touch. She had become, in the span of a single remarkable year, one of the most respected figures throughout the entire county. Her careful judgment and quiet determination, now spoken of with genuine admiration wherever she went. Margaret, who had stood loyally beside her throughout every difficult moment, remained her closest confidant and now served as the quarry's trusted administrator, managing the growing operation's daily affairs with the same careful precision Elena had once brought to the estate's troubled accounts. Duke Alessandro Vance, through the many months of careful partnership and shared purpose, found himself drawn to Elena in ways that extended far beyond simple gratitude or professional respect. What had begun as a desperate, almost careless gift from a man with nothing else left to offer had slowly transformed into something neither of them had anticipated: a deep, quiet understanding built through shared struggle, mutual respect, and the unmistakable recognition of finding, in each other, someone equally committed to doing what was right, regardless of the personal cost involved. On a warm afternoon, nearly 18 months after Elena first stood trembling before the Duke's desk, uncertain why she had been summoned at all, the two of them stood together instead, at the edge of Ravenscar Quarry, now thriving with careful, purposeful activity, rather than fearful silence. "It's remarkable," Alessandro said quietly, watching the workers below carefully extracting another section of the luminous vein, "how something everyone once feared has become the very thing that saved this entire county. It only needed someone willing to look closely enough to understand it, rather than simply fearing what they didn't yet know," Elena replied. He turned to face her fully then, his expression carrying a warmth she had come to recognize and treasure over these many transformative months. "I gave you that quarry, believing I was simply ridding myself of a burden I no longer had the strength to carry. I could never have imagined you would turn it into something that would rebuild not only this county's fortunes, but my own understanding of what genuine courage and integrity truly look like." "You gave me an opportunity, Your Grace," Elena said softly. "What I chose to do with it was simply refusing to let fear decide the ending, before I had even given myself the chance to try." As the sun began its slow descent behind the northern hills, casting a warm, golden light across the quarry's careful new activity, Elena felt a deep, settled sense of peace she had never quite known before. Not simply in the quarry's remarkable transformation, or even in the county's restored fortunes, but in the quiet, hard-won understanding of exactly who she had become throughout this entire extraordinary journey. The stone that once caused so much fear and tragedy had, through patience, courage, and an unshakable commitment to truth, ultimately become the very foundation upon which an entire county rebuilt itself, and upon which Elena Marchetti, once dismissed as nothing more than a poor bookkeeper handed a worthless curse, had built a life and a partnership far richer than any stone could ever measure.